Hello and welcome. I am Ejaz Haider and you're watching Indus Special. A World Bank report released on Wednesday titled Glass Half Full, Promise of Regional Trade in South Asia says the trade between Pakistan and India is only valued at a little over $2 billion, but it could be as high as $37 billion. The bank has also estimated Pakistan's potential trade with South Asia at $39.7 billion against the actual current trade of $5.1 billion. Why is this so? The report says the impediment is the artificial barriers between India and Pakistan and identifies 4 problem areas: tariff and para-tariff barriers to trade, complicated and non-transparent non-tariff measures, disproportionately high cost of trade, and trust deficit. While the first 3 deal with the economics of trade, the 4th, trust deficit, relates to the conflictual framework that informs relations between Pakistan and India. To discuss this, we have with us Dr. Nadeel, a former IMF economist who also served as Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission of Pakistan, Sanjay Katuria, lead economist and author of the report, Naseem Beg, who's the CEO of Arif Habib Consultancy, and Suhasini Haider, diplomatic editor, The Hindu. Let me just begin with Mr. Katuria here. What was the purpose of the report?
I mean, the purpose is, to move things along. Essentially, we believe, as you already have stated the numbers, that there is a huge gap between current and potential trade. If South Asia were to trade with each other, countries like other countries do in normal trading relationships, then trade in South Asia would be $67 billion instead of $23 billion. Then that's just goods, not including services. So there is this big gap. So, which, in other words, it is of concern to the World Bank because it is a loss in. There's a huge opportunity cost to the people of the region. There is less poverty reduction than there might be. Good quality jobs are being sacrificed, and very importantly, the consumers are not getting the best prices that they could possibly get because the region is under trading. So, bottom line is there is a massive welfare loss, and the World Bank is concerned with development. So, this is a regional development story, and the lack of trade, the most under trading region in the world. So, it is a lost development opportunity. So, we have a program. We have a program on South Asia. In the South Asia region, we have a program on trade and integration. And it's part of my job to try to understand that better and also then make constructive suggestions and talk to governments, policymakers, and then also seed and provide ideas into our own projects that the World Bank does.
But Mr. Katuria, here's the question. I mean, the reason I asked what the purpose is, obviously there is a report that gives us all these stats and makes the case for trade. Now, of course, as you know, as an economist, it's Econ 101 to say that there should be trade. Where there's a seller and there's a buyer, trade will happen, perhaps not dyadic trade, but it will still happen. My question is that this is not the first report of its kind. Is it something that the World Bank does periodically as some reminder of sorts? I mean, how does this play out?
I understand. So there are 2 things here. One is that, yes, one has to keep in a sense, every few years you do, even if the topic is repeated, but also the welfare loss, the opportunity cost keeps going up because South Asia is growing so fast and the opportunities in the region are growing, which we are not taking advantage of, right? So secondly, I think because I have been working in this now for a few years and I've been talking to a lot of stakeholders and policymakers, we tried to be a little different. So we tried to drill down and we didn't stay at a 1,000-foot level in the report. So we have got into specificities, which already we are hearing, because we have launched the report in several countries. And this is now we're launching it. We've done the launch in Pakistan as well. And so we are hearing policymakers liking the specificity of the recommendations, and that provides a way forward. We also go into, an incremental approach that also, small victories lead to bigger ones. So start small.
Okay,
Start
on the small victories thing, I think talking to the media in Islamabad, you talked about the Kartarpur Sahib corridor opening, and you said that it was a good gesture and perhaps it could lead to better relations. But we know, and this is where I want to pull Suhasini in, we know that the Indian government made it very clear that this opening will have no bearing on bilateral relations as far as other issues and disputes are concerned. So, Suhasini, give me a sense of, these reports coming out in a vacuum of sorts, not really, and I'm not saying that the report does not talk about trust deficit, it does, but there are political issues, and as I said, there's a conflictual framework in and through which India and Pakistan operate. So, what significance would you attach to such reports?
I think there's a lot of significance to such reports because it's a reminder of the cost of the daily tensions. And when a dollar figure is put to them, it makes a difference. Look, Ejaz, you said right now the Indian government is not willing to move beyond, something like Kartarpur. But I do take some solace from what Prime Minister Narendra Modi said, which is that the work of joining people must not stop. In respect to Kartarpur. And I would suggest that there are two very simple things that Pakistan can do if Pakistan is looking to somehow try and open up other spheres of dialogue. The first is really return the favor in terms of giving India most favored nation status. We know that this reached a point of a cabinet meeting way back in 2010, 2011. But it hasn't gone further than that. But India did give Pakistan the most favored nation status in the mid-90s. So
just to point out, Suhasini, that in 2013, the Pakistani government and then Indian government came very close to issuing a notification. We changed the nomenclature from the most favored nation to NDMA, which was basically semantics. But then we got a message from the BJP saying that Pakistan should hold on to this, and when the BJP government comes to power, then we will do this. There's an entire story behind that. I don't want to go into the details, but then that never happened because things became very different under Prime Minister Modi.
So the political relationship has really overruled this. But as far as I know, there's nothing to stop Pakistan from actually giving the MFN status, which is part of its commitments at international trade organizations as well. The second possibility is for Pakistan to abide by what it had signed on to in the Afghanistan-Pakistan Transit Trade Agreement, where it allowed basically national treatment to Afghan trade to go through to India. These are two small measures maybe that can be taken unilaterally by Islamabad, which actually could open the way for a lot more. 2 years ago when India wanted to send wheat to Afghanistan, when Afghanistan had a famine, that was something the Pakistani government at the time did not agree to. And it caused its own, it caused another spiral of tensions. I'm not saying that this will fix the problem, but if you're looking at simply at measures that can be taken in order to better trade and to take them forward, despite the fact that the political relationship is right now going nowhere, I think you could start with these two.
Okay, thank you so much, Suhasini, for giving me your view on this. Let me go back to Mr. Katuria. You heard what Suhasini said in terms of the political atmosphere. And given the fact that India is in the run-up to national elections and that Delhi has peddled a certain policy in relation to Pakistan, so the report essentially boils down to being a reminder. And I agree with Suhasini that, you put a dollar value to it, and that's important too. And obviously, the World Bank cannot do more than just point out to things. But just give me a sense of where do you get these figures from and what the methodology is.
So the methodology is actually very simple, Ejaz. So it's done through what we call gravity models. And essentially what this is doing is, it is very fact-based. There is no sort of hand here. Essentially what it is saying is that It takes millions of data points from all over trading relationships in the world. Takes all, whatever data is available across time and across countries. So it documents what is the average trading, econometrically, what's the average trading relationship in the world. And what determines more trade? One is GDP, one is distance, and one is language. So you have more GDP, you trade more. If you are closer to each other, you trade more. And if you have a common language, you trade more. These are the three things that come in. So what the report is saying is, what our methodology is saying is, if the region had traded with each other, just like any average relationship in the rest of the world, then India and Pakistan would be trading $37 billion instead of $2 billion. And South Asia would be trading $67 billion instead of $23 billion.
Can you put a dollar value on the informal trade between India and Pakistan?
Yeah, so we didn't do that ourselves, but there are studies done in ICRIER and institutions in Pakistan looking at the India-Pakistan part of the trade. So the figure is somewhere between $4 and $6 billion. In addition to the $2 billion of formal trade, there is this $4 to $6 billion of informal trade that is done.
Okay. Okay, stay with me for a little while longer. I just want to pull in Dr. Nadeemul Haq on this. I was talking to Santuria and I asked what the methodology is. I also asked him, since these reports keep coming up, periodically, so what exactly is the point unless one looks at the broader picture? And he said, and Swasni agreed with him, that this is essentially a reminder to put a dollar value on what the cost is and how much the region is losing. What's your take on this, Dr. Saab?
My take, Ejaz, is very simple. Adam Smith wrote in 1776, trade is good for us. Malthus and Ricardo, etc., had a debate, and then 1848, we had the repeal of the Corn Laws. By definition, trade is good for us. We all know that. This is economics 101. It's the first theorem in economics that we learn when we study economics. Now, going on from there, I don't see why so many studies come out on it. And most of them emanate from the World Bank or DFID or something. So I wonder, and I keep asking them, why do you want to push this agenda so hard for the last 20 years, having spent $100 million on this issue? So I sometimes don't understand. It's a political issue. It's not a trade issue. It's really not a trade issue.
Okay, that's a very important point. Since Sanjay Katuria has to go, let me just take this back to him. Dr. Nadeemul Haq is saying that this is a political issue. It's not an economic issue. And he also wonders why these studies come out of DFID and the World Bank. And he used the term pushing the agenda. Would you agree with that?
No, I mean, a part of our role as economists is, to put policies. And if there is a welfare loss, then it is part of our function because, we are economists and political scientists. I mean, so it's part of our role to ensure that whatever we do makes good sense from a development policy point of view. I think he said, believe that trade is good. So I think the plea in the report and the recommendation in the report is, instead of being subservient to politics, can trade drive, to some extent at least? I mean, look at the China-India relationship, look at the China and the Taiwan relationship in terms of trade. There are booming relationships, right? Politics has not intervened. So our point is, can we let trade play its due role? Trade leading to connectivity, leading to people-to-people trust. So that's why we have a whole chapter, very unusual in an economic report. Chapter 5 in the report, about the trust deficit and how one particular experiment in South Asia, which is the border heart between India and Bangladesh, is trying to get over that trust deficit in a small way. And then that's the small victory. Similarly, Karnataka is another example of reducing that trust deficit by generating people-to-people contact. So I think it is very much a part of our role in the World Bank to be trying to do this kind of thing because it makes development policy.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sanjay Katuria, for giving up time and discussing the report that you authored. Dr. Nadeemul Haq, he's essentially saying that we have a chapter in the report which talks about trust deficit and talks about the politics of the subcontinent and South Asia in general. But it's important to talk about these things. And it's part of their remit at the World Bank to study various regions. But the interesting thing that he talked about, and I want to draw your attention to that, which is that trade, he was implying, he didn't use the term, but he implied that trade could lead to connectivity and peace. Now, in the run-up to the First World War and also in the run-up to the Second World War, the nations that warred and where millions were killed, there was a lot of trade, but that did not stop hostilities. So, would you agree that trade, connectivity is going to lead to peace, or do you think that is not possible?
Just this is your subject. You deal with politics. And you know how nations go to war and over what. And you can see what's happening now with US and China and within the European Union, Brexit. Trade is always a political issue. We economists lay out a fundamental theorem, as I said, theorem that we've adhered to and actually worshipped for the last 200-300 years. We believe in free trade. We believe in globalization. I will not challenge it. I will never challenge it. So I don't need to see any estimates telling me that, things will improve. And what he talked about gravity models, I also feel that we need to think about it and worry about it. If the informal trade is 5 billion and the official trade is 2 billion, and they're saying that we'll get to 37 billion, that sounds a little, I would say a little difficult to understand. Gravity models basically are saying that we'll take the US and Canada trade versus the Japan and Korea trade versus the Germany and France trade. We'll average across them and then we'll apply it to South Asia.
Correct.
Now, if you apply it across South Asia, I would submit, and I asked Sanjay this the other day in Punjab Club when he was presenting his thing, that look, I worked in the East African community, as you know. I was there as the advisor to the East African community. And one of the puzzles was that they are a community that has made up their mind 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, that they wanted to come together. I was only advising them on monetary policy, but the trade in goods and services was very low between the two countries. Because trade also depends on what you and I are going to trade.
Absolutely, in terms of manufacturing and in terms of your...
both growing wheat, then we have very little trade. If we are both growing cotton, we have very little. So there are different...
So therefore you're saying that, this gravity model where you pick up these dyadic trades, Canada, US,
I think
France,
there has become
Germany.
an industry, especially led by the World Bank, which I call the economics of alarming numbers. Every study that you see, they come up with a huge numbers. So the numbers have kind of lost magnitude. Oh, if you cure sanitation, you'll have 3% growth more. Oh, if you do this, you'll have 10% growth more. So, these numbers have become so incredible that we don't believe them.
Okay, so if we leave aside the numbers for a moment, in terms of how much the trade would be, perhaps it won't be $37 billion. Perhaps it would be $8 billion, which is still $6 billion more than $2 billion right now. Mm-hmm. So there is some kind of advantage there. But my issue is that most of these reports, they kind of, they're put out in a vacuum of sorts. Or perhaps they simply want to give us the fundamental truths about trading, which you said it's Econ 101. But then there is the ground reality, the realpolitik, which tells us something completely different. Do you think that the IMF or the World Bank or the ADB or other international institutions that put out these reports need to focus more on the politics of it rather than just the fundamental economics part of it?
Ejaz, when I was at the Planning Commission, the World Bank and DFID had commissioned studies. I don't think there was a single economist apart from me, because I was in the government, who hadn't done a study on this subject. Every economist that I know has done at least one, maybe two studies on this subject. And I keep asking them, where's the data? If you don't trade, there's no data, right? If you're speculating on trade, then it's something else. If you're taking other countries' data and putting it here, I have a number of issues with that, because methodologically we have seen that my data cannot be applied to you, right? So I think we have to think about it. Now, every economist did this study over the last 10 years or something. We've got about 50 studies of this type in the pipeline. And I kept asking DFID, they called me to an event, for example, where they presented all these studies. I was there as a chief guest. There were about 50 studies. At the end of it, I said, I don't understand how this became priority number one for us in economics. Yes, politics maybe, But economics, it is not my priority
okay.
number one.
So this is very interesting because Naseem Beg is also with us. Mr. Beg, I'm sure you heard what Dr. Nadeemul Haq is talking about. We'd earlier discussed the genesis of the report and also the purport of the report. And where do these figures come from? And whether gravity model is the model that can be applied, getting data from perhaps the advanced countries, dyadic trade, and then apply that to South Asia. Do you think that is the right methodology, or would you disagree with the methodology?
Start with saying this, that I have actually on occasions tried to do business with counterparts in India. Going back to, say, the mid-1980s, when I was in the automobile engineering business, I tried going across to see if I could get licensing for manufacturing certain components here rather than get expensive licenses from Japan, etc. And then later on, once I was in the financial services, I would say a good 20 years thereafter, that I actually tried, now that was where the Indians had the advantage. I wanted to learn from them. This time around, I was trying to peddle two things. One, a more modern data management system that I had created for our mutual fund business. And secondly, actually running a Sharia-compliant mutual fund in India. So all my efforts failed. And I think the Deem has said the right thing. It's politics. I would make a stronger statement. We have been at an undeclared war with India throughout. And this report talks of these border trade type measures, which I think are kind of naive. When you are at war with another nation, forget everything else. And in any case, when we have trade agreements, what we are saying in a trade agreement is that I feel threatened or my industry feels threatened by the other country, and therefore I want to create a wall of protection for my industry. In Pakistan's case, and we won't go into the reasons, but we feel much weaker in terms of our industry compared to India. So there is a strong reason to be overly protective. And at the end of the day, if we take what trade is, many communities, and if I can sort of refer to David Graeber's the first 5,000 years of debt, and he traces trading relationships, and it's in many communities trying to get the better of the other. And in fact, he quotes the Pashtuns as one of those communities. So what I'm trying to say is, when you're trying to get the better of the other and you feel that you're the weaker party, you're going to have barriers. And especially when you are, as I said, at war, an undeclared war. So I don't think anything is going to happen. When I went across for my engineering business, everyone I visited was then later on visited by their intelligence agency with feedback I got later, and they were just, petrified of even talking to me. So that's the ground reality.
That's the ground reality. But let me go back to Nadeemul Haq. Protection. Do we need to protect our industries?
I don't think so.
No,
certainly
doesn't
not.
Everyone do that?
People do that on occasion, but people don't protect their industries for 60, 70 years. We have protected our industry for a long period of time. We should stop protecting our industry. We should make them competitive, but even more important.
What if they go under?
That's a part of life. You and I will go under, right? Why shouldn't industry go under? It's a part of life. Death is a part of life. Yeah. Industry must die as well. If you look at the Dow Jones Index, Ejaz, today, the Dow Jones Index has seen more death in the last 30 years than you can imagine. The companies that were there 30 years ago are no longer there. They're all gone. Some of them have died. So, fine. What's wrong with it?
Let me play out a scenario.
Take this, for example, the famous, iconic company Sears has died.
Okay, but let me play a scenario. Yeah. So we have our automobile industry. Supposing trade opens and we start trading with India. And so the Indians want to send in the cars manufactured there to Pakistan. which are cheaper, better quality, which means our automobile industry dies. Is that a scenario we want? Is that a scenario that we shouldn't be worried about?
You're talking about bilateral trade.
Yeah.
I don't think we should focus on bilateral trade. I don't want Indian cars to come in as opposed to Pakistan cars. If you put that proposition, I'd say no.
Okay.
But globally, we should be able to import cars from anywhere. Our industry must compete. I'll give you this example, which is very important. You remember Bholu Pelwan?
Yeah.
He was protected by the government. He was Rustam-e-Zaman, and he was protected by the government. He wouldn't compete with anybody. First chance when he had to compete, because of the public pressure for him to compete with Inoki, he died. He died, not died, but
Yeah.
the myth died.
That wasn't Bholu, that was Aki Pelwan.
No, but the myth was Bholu.
Yeah,
Aki just took his place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Aki took his place, right?
Yeah.
The question is, a protected industry never works. Everything works in open competition.
You want us to import cars from everywhere.
Of course.
But not from India.
No, not from, no, I didn't say that. I've maintained. Trade is very good. We should trade with everybody. We should be open, right? All I'm questioning is so many studies and no results, and why are we studying this subject again and again? All I'm saying to you is we've got 10,000 priorities. I was telling you, as a planning commission chief of this country, I had many priorities. Trade with India was a very low priority for me. Even now for Imran, it's a low priority. He's trying to do poverty, he's trying to do energy, he's trying to do so many things. We've got energy as a major issue. We've got our governance as a major issue. We've got our property rights as a major issue. We've got our markets as a major issue. We've got our tariff policy, our fiscal policy as a major issue. These are all very important issues. I think the World Bank should be focusing on these rather than leading us another direction.
But
all I'm saying is this is a huge agenda.
No, but doesn't it work somewhat like this, that you get some funding to do a particular thing? And so if there is funding to put out a...
And that's what I'd like to know, where the funding is coming from.
I mean, the World Bank is funding
the World Bank is funding it, then the question is why? I mean, there is a political agenda. It's a political question. There has to be a political agenda. It's not an economic question. For me, this is not an economic question. It doesn't even require an economic report. Trade is important per se, period. We should trade with everybody, per se. Now, if you want to go in and say, no, hey, do this, do that, because we have a political agenda, that's fine. I mean, USA does this, DFID does this, everybody does it. But World Bank is a multilateral institution. It should not do it.
Okay, so I have to wrap up the segment also, but I quickly go back to Mr. Beg. Mr. Beg, do you agree with what Dr. Nadeemul Haq is saying?
Partially, not entirely. I mean, whether or not we ought to have protections is a different subject. We are currently talking of India-Pakistan trade. And as I said earlier, there are a whole lot of reasons why our industry is weak, including the automobile industry, which I've been a part of. And I can assure you that we are at a very weak place as compared with India. When I went there back in the mid-80s, they were just starting out producing the Suzuki, Maruti, whatever they called it. And they started with saying, we are going to delete the engine from the import kit, the rest we can keep importing. While we in Pakistan start with the little easy things and never get to the engine. So in the last 70 years, we've not been able to get beyond tinkering with the non-sophisticated items, if I might call them that. Now there's a whole sort of history of why we are so badly off and so overly protected, and there's not enough competition within Pakistan, and then therefore we end up a lot of rent-seeking industry. And clearly we are in no position to compete with anyone, let alone India. But when we look at India, to me, the fear of protection, albeit I would say we've been hit more badly, especially our SMEs, by our great friend China. Where they've dumped stuff into Pakistan's market, etc.
That's a very interesting point you make. That's all the time I have for this topic. Thank you so much, Naseem Beg and Dr. Nadeemul Haq. We'll take a short break, and when we return, we'll look at Britain's Brexit blues in the run-up to the December 11 parliamentary vote. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Since the 23rd June 2016 referendum that took place in the United Kingdom and Gibraltar to ascertain whether the UK would remain in the European Union or leave, that country has seen intense debate in the run-up to the withdrawal process. culminating with Britain leaving the European Union on 29th March 2019. The referendum had resulted in a simple majority of 51.9% being in favor of leaving the European Union. While legally the referendum was non-binding, the government of that time had promised to implement the result and initiated the official EU withdrawal process. Now, members of British Parliament will vote on a draft Brexit agreement with the European Union on December 11. The vote will take place after 5 days of parliamentary debate. To discuss what happens on December 11 and thereafter, we have with us Athar Kazmi, who is a political analyst based in Islamabad, and Professor Steve Keen, who joins us from London and is an economic analyst. Professor Keen, let me kick off with you. What exactly are we looking at, especially the 5-day debate and then the vote in the parliament?
Well, I think we're looking at a vote which will fail. There's no way that May has a majority for what she's proposing. And what she's basically proposed is continued membership of the EU with the sole change of removing freedom of movement of labour. That's about the only real effect of her proposal. And that doesn't satisfy any of the sides in the parliamentary debate, though it probably satisfies a lot of the people who actually voted for Brexit in the first place.
Okay, so one of the analysts that I was reading thought that Prime Minister May, unless she delays the vote, which is the 11th December vote, might be about to become one of the most important dates in British history. In fact, he said more important than even 23rd June 2016. So if MPs vote down May's withdrawal agreement, as nearly all ministers expect them to, they will set Britain on course for either the softest possible Brexit or a second referendum. Is that something that you would agree with?
I don't think it's that important a date, frankly. I think what Britain did to itself over austerity is far more damaging than what it's talking about doing via Brexit. But this, to me, is an end game which Yanis Varoufakis picked very, very well when the whole thing began by saying that the European Union does not want anybody to leave, and they will give you the runaround. And if you try to negotiate with Brussels, you'll get absolutely nowhere.
Oh, okay. So what are the economic impact of leaving the European Union?
Oh, there's a range of ones which can apply, but of course people are focusing mainly on the fact there may be tariffs and a trade barrier between England and the European, which would be a significant change. At the same time, if this goes through, there could be another devaluation of the pound, which would compensate for the impact of the tariffs. So it's quite a up in the air and unknown outcome. But I don't regard pulling out of a trade agreement as anywhere near as damaging as most economists argue it is, because it's more the investment that takes place in your economy that determines whether you grow or not. And the main problem with Britain for the last 2 or 3 decades has been a failure to invest in its own manufacturing industry. So to me, Brexit is just a sign of frustration with the European Union rather than something which is going to be gargantuanly important to the British economy.
Okay, so there are other analyses that actually paint a bleaker picture. I see that you think that that might not be the case. In any case, if Britain does leave, it'll be 3 years before these other things kind of kick in. But give me a sense of, in theory, if there were another referendum, would the result be the same, or perhaps the Remainers might get a bigger vote this time?
It could easily go the same way. I've seen some people talking about, who are on the Remain side, talking about what they've seen in the way the European Union has treated Britain in the whole process. And this is, of course, what Yanis Varoufakis said they would do, giving Britain the runaround. Some of them are now saying, well, I might vote for leave. So you may get people who were persuaded to vote for leave who go Remain. You might get those voting Remain going the opposite direction. There's no real guarantee that there would be a decisive vote one way or the other if another referendum were held.
There's also a sense that Prime Minister May's strategy was to play chicken with Parliament, and that her team saw virtue in intransigence and calculated that at the last moment MPs would get out of her way. Is that something that you agree with?
That's true. I mean, May's been an extremely ineffective performer. Pretty bad in Parliament, of course, disastrous on the hustlings, where she almost lost to Jeremy Corbyn when she called a snap election trying to destroy Jeremy Corbyn. So she's a very ineffective politician and seems to be somebody who plays a game of stonewalling. As you're describing, she's done the same thing with her behaviour when she ran the Home Office. And stonewalling works when obstruction is what you're supposed to do, which is the way they treat the Home Office and visa applications these days. It doesn't work so well when you're trying to lead the country somewhere.
Okay, let me pull in Mr. Atar Kazmi here. Mr. Kazmi, do you agree with what Professor Keane is saying?
To some extent, yes. It's not going to be easy for Britain after leaving Brexit, to be honest. Recent research came out that Britain will be, 200 billion worse off in the next 10 years or 15 years. So there will be an impact on economy. So at the moment, the thing is that EU and Britain, they don't know what is going to happen in the future, to be honest. This is something unprecedented. We haven't seen anything like this before. Article 50 of Lisbon Treaty has been triggered, but this has not happened before in the history. So what will be the future? What future holds for Britain or EU is not clear at the moment. We can only guess at this point.
Okay, so the May government seems to think that fear of no deal would possibly bring former Remainers into the fold, and simultaneously, Leavers would probably reluctantly, if I may say, take this imperfect Brexit. So is that something that you think is you would agree with that?
The thing is that, to be honest, even at the moment, the biggest issue is backstop, which is the border of Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. It used to be it is still an intra-EU border. As my colleague from London was saying before me, that only thing they wanted to achieve, most of the people who wanted Brexit, they wanted to achieve to stop the freedom of movement. They were worried about immigration and soft borders. If there is still a soft border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, this would not achieve the desire, whatever they desired for. So at the moment, I think, to be honest, it would be too early to say, if they will accept this deal or not. But the votes on the 11th could really plunge UK into fresh, political mayhem, to be honest, because at the moment, as I said before, we haven't seen anything like this before. If May loses the vote in Common, this could trigger even a vote of no confidence against her, and we might see a change of government in the UK in the near future.
Okay, so change of government is fine. I mean, that's a democratic process. But when you use the term mayhem, which is a very strong word, are you just referring to a vote of no confidence in a change of government or something more than that?
Change, probably chaos, may describe it better. But the thing is that if she loses the vote, I spoke to a member of parliament a couple of weeks ago, and I was told from a Tory party, and I was told that there are about 80 members from ruling party who are against this deal. And I'm not sure if she'll be able to convince all of them in the next 4 or 5 days. So there will be a challenge, challenge to her leadership and challenge to her premiership. So if her leadership is challenged and DUP, the coalition partner, decides to pull out of this agreement, they decide not to vote for her. So we might see a change, a dramatic change in the parliament, and we might see a new elections in the UK.
Okay, stay with me. Professor Keane, is May losing the vote a given? Is that inevitable?
I think it is a given. She has really gone for the softest of possible Brexits. And there's a large part of the Tory party which went for Brexit on the basis of regaining sovereignty. Now, the European Union is not designed to surrender sovereignty to anyone. It's always been designed to accumulate sovereignty and to grow more centralised. And what's been proposed in Brexit in some ways is like California California deciding he wanted to leave the United States of America. It would have no chance of pulling that off, and America would be trying to prevent it all the way through. That's how the European Union is behaving on this particular front, and that therefore is going to alienate the people who were in her party, were strong Brexiteers. So there's no chance of her getting this vote through.
Let me go back to Mr. Atar Kazmi. The same question to you, sir. Do you think it could possibly split the Tory party?
There is already a split within the party. If you by split you mean a merging of a new party, I don't think so. But there will be definitely a leadership challenge to May's leadership if the things carry on like this. And some, the chairman of committee of ruling parties backbenchers, Sir Graham Brady, he said the other day that they would like the vote to be deferred because they are not sure at the moment that they will, they'll manage to get it through. So there are different, opinions within the party, and these are tough times for the ruling party. And as we know that their working majority is only 13, and they are a coalition government. So I'm not sure about the future of the deal, but I'm quite sure about the future of this government, which is very, very bleak.
Which is very, very bleak. We're going to take a short break. I have to thank Mr. Atar Kazmi and Professor Steve Keen for giving me their insights. At the other end of the break, we'll continue with this topic. Welcome back to Indus Special. We continue with our discussion of the December 11 vote in the British Parliament with reference to Brexit. And we now have Dr. Helena Ferrand, who is a political analyst based in London, and Simon Mannings, who is an economic analyst. Dr. Ferrand, give me a sense of where this vote might go. I was earlier talking to my panelists, and they said that Prime Minister May's losing the vote is a given. Do you share that view?
Yes, I do. So there's three possibilities for the vote on the 11th. Obviously, it can still pass. It's not very likely. If it passes, then the government's just going to, introduce it into legislation, and then it's going to come into force on the 29th of March, and this will start the transition. Which is, expected to last for at least 2 years. It can actually pass with some amendments. So we now know that thanks to Dominic Greaves, we can now actually make changes to the agreement. If those amendments come into force and the deal is passed, then what happens is that probably they'll have to be renegotiated with the European Union, and this is not likely at all to happen. The EU is not open to renegotiation at all. And then there's a third option, obviously, which is quite likely, which is that the deal is going to be rejected. If the deal is rejected, then what happens is that the government has 21 days to actually present a number of other options. And essentially there's it's actually seven main options, basically, coming out of what could happen during those 21 days. The first option, obviously, is that there's no deal. So nothing happens, and on the 29th of March, the UK actually leaves without a deal, and so there will be loss of access to the common market, loss of access to a number of services, transport, energy, security.
But that will kick in 3 years after Britain leaves.
No. So if there is no deal, what happens? This will happen on the 29th of March 2019. Okay. If there is no deal, so if the deal is rejected, then on the 29th of March, simply the connection between the EU and the UK will be completely cut off. And this means that the UK will have to really speed up international agreements that will have to try to compensate things such access to the Open Skies Agreement, which allows British planes to enter European space, for instance. All those kinds of agreements. It could also be that we can have a second vote, so the MPs can actually be asked to vote again on the deal. It can be they can try to renegotiate. So Theresa May can actually go back to the European Union and actually try to renegotiate the deal. As I mentioned before, that's really not going to happen. We can have a general election. That's quite possible. We can always. there's also another option, which is we're now starting to have more and more momentum for, which is another referendum. So what we call a people's vote. So they can actually, you can have different parties actually pushing for this, and this is very much happening at the moment.
Okay, I'm happy you talked about the second referendum. I just wanted to ask you, with reference to that, in theory, if that happens, do you think the Remainers are going to get the bigger vote this time, or it'll be more or less the same as in 2016?
Well, according to the most recent surveys, actually, Remain does have the possibility of winning, but it's still by a very small margin. I think we could be very much in the same situation, and if we are, then basically, it's a very much of an impasse, because there's no better deal that the UK is going to actually achieve with the EU. So we would still be in the same situation, which is, against a rock and a hard place, essentially. So that's very problematic. And then there's a last option, which is very much on the table now, given that we're about to hear on Monday whether from the Court of Justice whether the UK can actually unilaterally withdraw Article 50. And this means that if on Monday we are given the green light for this is very simple. It means that the UK can now say that actually it gives up on Brexit altogether and it just stays in the EU.
Okay, let me move to the economic side of it and bring in Simon Mannings. There is a sense that leaving the European Union could be problematic for Britain as far as the British economy is concerned, but then there are also other analyses that say perhaps the figures that are being thrown up are not really going to happen. What exactly is your take on that in terms of the impact on the economy?
At the moment, the UK and the EU have a lot of international trade. International trade represents about, between the UK and the EU, about 50% of international trade in the UK. So it's a very important economic aspect that is being decided here. It's extraordinary times. I think the more that there is uncertainty, then that's going to hurt business in the medium and short terms, because if businesses don't have confidence in the economic environment, they delay investment decisions. And then if you look at the whole premise of Brexit, with controlled movement of people across borders, a lot of businesses employ a lot of Europeans, and they're concerned about retaining or having access to that employment pool. And because of the Brexit uncertainties, they just don't know what's going to happen in the future.
Okay, so you stressed on the medium to short term. Are you implying that in the long term things would be better?
Well, I think in the long term things can be clearer, and having clarity removes the uncertainty. So that has to be a positive. And I think with the in the long term, if after Brexit, if the UK has greater freedom to negotiate international trade agreements, then there's every opportunity that they could negotiate better deals and international trade agreements in the future than they have currently today. But that's quite speculative, and you just don't know if that's going to be the case or not. So there will always be that uncertainty, and you've always got to take into account the current state that the EU is such a large trading partner with the UK, and at the moment we have free borders, so there's free movement of goods from Europe to the UK and from UK to Europe. And if there was some kind of tariff or border control in operation in the future, then I guess from an administrative perspective, that's going to make the movement of goods slower, which will mean that it costs more. And also it's going to create an administrative burden on businesses for whenever they import or export goods and services.
Okay. So last question, what timeline would you put on the short to medium to long term?
Well, I think that the short term is, I mean, there's an immediate short term of next week. As your analyst pointed out, there's a huge uncertainty over how that vote is going to play in the House of Commons. After that, there's a 2-year, if it's passed, there'll be another 2-year period where we're kind of in a limbo where we have to negotiate our long-term position and trade position with the EU. So that's another level of uncertainty, which would run for like 2 years. And then after that, having done a deal of some sorts with the EU, then that'll be the premise for the long-term arrangement. But I think, we can't really get to the long-term visibility until we've addressed, what's right in front of us next week and then the interim 2-year period.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Simon Mannings, for giving us your view on this. Dr. Farhan, if we go by the hindsight, and I know we say hindsight is 2020, back to the 2016 referendum, it was, technically speaking, legally not binding, but the then government had promised that it will initiate proceedings post-referendum, and so it did. Now, when you look back, do you think that was a bad decision?
Well, I don't think they had an option, to be honest. Yes, a referendum is not a legally binding instrument, but it is very risky to actually ignore a democratic vote, even if it's, in theory, not legally binding. So if you're actually saying, well, okay, I now have the opinion of the population, but I've chosen to actually ignore it, there will be political consequences, if not social and economic consequences in terms of uncertainty, if not actually violence in the streets. So we have to be very careful with that. So I think that at the time it was the correct choice. Obviously, it put the government in a very complicated situation. We always knew that actually it was not possible to have a better deal than the one the UK already has within the European Union. So in a way, it was a lost battle from the beginning. But in hindsight, it was still the best thing to actually follow the referendum's decision.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Helena Rand, for being with us and giving us your view on the December 11, 2018 vote, which is on Tuesday. So it'll be interesting to watch the parliamentary debate and also the vote, which most people seem to, the analysts seem to think, the Prime Minister May is going to lose. This is all for today. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye for me.